Thomas wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stepped off the ferry at Dover. The salty sea air filled his lungs, and he clutched a small brown suitcase that contained everything he owned. It was a cold morning in March 1962, and the 24-year-old man from County Cork had just crossed the Irish Sea with nothing but hope burning in his chest. Back home in Ireland, Thomas had worked on his father's small farm. The land was rocky and poor, and no matter how hard they worked, there was never enough money. When Mary told him she was expecting their first child, Thomas knew he had to find a better way. He had heard stories of men who went to England and found good work in the growing cities. With tears in his eyes, he had kissed Mary goodbye and promised to send for her soon. London was bigger and noisier than anything Thomas had ever imagined. The streets were crowded with cars and buses, and tall buildings reached toward the grey sky. He found a tiny room in a boarding house and immediately began looking for work. Thomas was strong and willing to work hard. By his second day in England, he had found a job at a construction site. The foreman, a gruff man named Charlie, looked at Thomas's calloused hands and nodded approvingly. "You'll do," Charlie said. "Be here at 6 tomorrow morning." The work was backbreaking. Thomas carried heavy bags of cement, mixed mortar, and loaded bricks onto scaffolding. His back ached every night, but he thought of Mary and the baby growing inside her. And he kept working. The pay was better than anything he could have earned in Ireland. But one job was not enough. Thomas needed to save money quickly so he could bring Mary to England and find them a proper home. In the evenings, he found work washing dishes at Romano's, an Italian restaurant near his boarding house. Mr. Romano was kind to Thomas and often let him take home leftover bread and soup every night. Thomas would count his money carefully. He kept it in an old tobacco tin under his narrow bed. Slowly, coin by coin and note by note, his savings grew. He wrote letters to Mary every week, telling her about his progress and his dreams for their future. After 6 months, Thomas had saved enough money to bring Mary to England. She arrived on a sunny September morning, her belly round with their child. Thomas had found them a small flat above a bakery, and though it was cramped and the walls were thin, it felt like a palace compared to the boarding house. Their son James was born in November, a healthy baby with his father's strong hands and his mother's gentle eyes. Thomas would hold little James in the evenings after his long days of work, whispering promises about the life they would build together. One day, while walking through the outskirts of town on his day off, Thomas discovered something that changed everything. There was a small piece of land for sale, about the size of 2 garden plots. It sat at the end of a quiet street, and it was cheaper than all the other land because it had problems. When it rained heavily, water would collect there and make the ground muddy and soft. Other people saw these problems and walked away, but Thomas saw something different. He saw morning sunlight streaming across the space. He saw room for a vegetable garden. He saw his son James playing safely in their own yard. He saw home. The land cost more money than Thomas had ever spent on anything in his life. He and Mary talked about it for weeks. They counted their savings again and again. It would take almost everything they had saved, and it would mean living very carefully for many months. "What if we cannot build a house?" Mary asked one evening as she fed baby James. "What if the ground is too soft?" Thomas took her hand gently. "Mary, my father always told me that good land knows a man's heart. This land is waiting for us. I can feel it." On a Saturday morning in early spring, Thomas walked to the land office and made the purchase. He signed his name carefully on the papers, his hands shaking slightly with excitement and fear. The land was theirs. That afternoon, Thomas borrowed a shovel from his neighbor and walked to his new property. He stood at the edge of his land and looked across the muddy ground. Then he pushed the shovel into the earth and began to dig. Mrs. Peterson, who lived in the house next door, watched from her kitchen window. She shook her head and said to her husband, "That young Irish fellow has made a terrible mistake. That ground will never hold a proper house." But Thomas kept digging. Every evening after his construction work and every weekend morning, he would come to his land with his shovel. Slowly, carefully, he began to dig the foundation for his dream house. Mary would bring him tea in a thermos and sandwiches wrapped in brown paper. She would sit on an old wooden crate that Thomas had found behind the bakery, with baby James sleeping in her arms. "Thomas," she would say softly, "are you certain about this? It seems like such hard work." Thomas would stop digging and look at his wife and son. His face would break into a gentle smile, and he would say, "Mary, this house will be built with love. Our children will grow up here safely. One day, James will bring his own children to visit, and they will play in these very rooms that I am building for them now." As the weeks passed, the foundation slowly took shape. 3 years had passed since Thomas first pushed his shovel into that muddy ground. The foundation he had dug by hand now supported wooden walls that reached toward the sky. Every evening after his construction work and every weekend morning, Thomas could be found at his building site with hammer in hand and determination in his heart. The house was taking shape slowly but surely. Thomas had learned carpentry skills from the older men at his construction job. Charlie, his foreman, had taught him how to measure wood properly and how to make joints that would last for decades. "Take your time, lad," Charlie would say. "A house built right will stand for 100 years. Mary now had 3 children to care for. After James came Emma, a bright little girl with curious eyes and her father's stubborn streak. Then came Robert, a chubby baby who gurgled happily while watching his father work. The children had grown up round the building site, and it felt as natural to them as a playground. Emma, now 7 years old, was Thomas's best helper. She could hand him the right size nail without being asked and knew exactly where he kept his favorite hammer. James, at 5, was strong enough to carry small pieces of wood, and he took great pride in helping his father. Even little Robert would sit in his mother's lap and clap his hands when Thomas hammered in a particularly difficult nail. "Look, Mama," Emma would say proudly, "Daddy and I built this wall together." Mary would smile and kiss her daughter's forehead. "Yes, darling, you are all building our home together." But life was not kind to the growing family. During the cold winter when Emma turned 10, disaster struck. Thomas was carrying a heavy beam at the construction site when his foot slipped on a patch of ice. He fell hard, and the beam came down on his left arm. The sound of breaking bone was like a gunshot in the cold air. Charlie drove Thomas to the hospital, where the doctor wrapped his arm in a heavy white cast. No work for 3 months. The doctor said firmly, "That bone needs time to heal properly." Thomas stared at the cast and felt his stomach drop. No work meant no money. No money meant no food for his children and no materials for his house. He walked home slowly, his arm throbbing with pain and his mind racing with worry. Mary took one look at her husband's pale face and knew what she had to do that very evening. She knocked on doors throughout their neighborhood, offering to do sewing and mending work. Mrs. Peterson, the woman who had once shaken her head at Thomas's muddy land, was the first to offer a job. "I have 3 dresses that need hemming," Mrs. Peterson said kindly, "and my husband's work shirts need new buttons." Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about Mary's skilled needlework. Soon she had more sewing than she could handle. She worked late into the night by lamplight, her fingers moving quickly and carefully over fabric. Thomas felt guilty watching his wife work so hard, but Mary would smile and say, "We are a team. Thomas, when you cannot carry the load, I will carry it for you." When spring came and Thomas's arm had healed, he returned to work with renewed energy. The house had waited patiently for him, and he threw himself into the building with passion. By late summer, he had finished the walls and was ready to put on the roof. The roof was the most difficult part of the building. Thomas worked carefully, measuring each beam and checking every angle. Emma and James helped by handing him nails and holding boards steady. After weeks of careful work, the roof was complete. Thomas stood back and looked at his house with deep satisfaction. It looked like a real home now, with walls and windows and a solid roof to keep his family dry. But nature had other plans. In September, a terrible storm swept across the region. The wind howled like a wild animal, and rain fell so hard it sounded like stones hitting the ground. Thomas and his family huddled in their small rented flat, listening to the storm rage through the night. When morning came, Thomas rushed to check on his house. What he found broke his heart. Half of his carefully built roof had been torn away by the wind. Broken boards lay scattered across his yard, and rain had soaked into the wooden frame he had worked so hard to build. Thomas stood in the drizzling rain, staring at the damage. All those evenings of work, all those weekends of careful construction, destroyed in one night. He felt tears mixing with the raindrops on his face. Emma appeared beside him, her small hand slipping into his rough, work-worn hand. She was 12 now, old enough to understand disappointment, but still young enough to believe in miracles. "Dad," she said quietly, looking up at his sad face, "we can fix it. We always fix things when they break." Thomas looked down at his daughter and felt something shift inside his chest. She was right. They had faced the broken arm, the months without money, the worry and the fear. They had fixed all of those problems together. They could fix this too the next morning. Thomas picked up his hammer and began pulling away the damaged boards. To his surprise, Mr. Henry from the house next door appeared with an armload of wooden planks. "Thought you might need these," Mr. Henry said with a shy smile. Soon Mrs. Wilson arrived with a pot of hot vegetable soup and thick slices of fresh bread. Other neighbors began appearing with tools, nails, and willing hands. Even Mrs. Peterson came, bringing her husband and two grown sons to help. By evening, the roof was not only repaired but stronger than it had ever been before. 16 years had passed since Thomas first dug into that muddy piece of ground with nothing but hope and a borrowed shovel. The small plot of land that everyone said would never hold a proper house now supported a beautiful home that stood proudly at the end of the quiet street. The house was not the largest on their road, and it certainly was not the most expensive. But every corner of it told a story of love, patience, dreams that had slowly become reality. Thomas had built more than walls and a roof. He had built a sanctuary where his family could grow and be happy over the years. Thomas had added special touches that made their house unique. In the kitchen, he had built a cozy window seat with soft cushions where Mary could sit with her morning tea and watch the sun rise over their neighborhood. The seat was positioned perfectly so she could also keep an eye on her vegetable garden, where tomatoes and carrots grew in neat rows. In Emma's room, Thomas had created a secret compartment behind a loose floorboard where she had kept her diary and her collection of pretty stones. In James's room, he had built a hidden shelf behind the bookcase where James stored his wooden soldiers and his treasured marbles. Even little Robert, now 13, had his own special hiding place where he kept his bird feathers and interesting insects. The most beautiful feature of all was the front door. Thomas had spent months carving an intricate rose into the solid oak wood. It was Mary's favorite flower, and every petal had been shaped with love and careful attention. Neighbors would often stop to admire the door, and children would trace the carved petals with their small fingers. Emma was now 23 years old and had married a kind young man named David who worked at the local bank. They lived in a small apartment across town, but Emma visited her parents every Sunday for a dinner. On this particular autumn day, she had brought someone very special to meet his grandfather. Thomas was sitting in his favorite chair by the front window, reading the newspaper, when he heard Emma's familiar knock on the carved rose door. But today her knock sounded different, more excited than usual. When Thomas opened the door, Emma stood there with a blanket-wrapped bundle in her arms and the biggest smile he had ever seen on her face. "Papa," she said softly, "I would like you to meet your grandson, William." Thomas felt his knees go weak with joy. He had been waiting for this moment since the day Emma was born. Carefully, gently, Emma placed the tiny baby into her father's strong arms. William was perfect, with tiny fingers and bright eyes that seemed to look right into Thomas's soul. Thomas carried his grandson into the living room, the same room where he had laid every floorboard with his own hands, where he had painted every wall, and where his family had shared thousands of meals and conversations. He sat down in his chair and looked at the baby's peaceful face. "Look round, little William," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Your grandfather built this house with love. Every nail I hammered, every board I placed, every window I installed was put there while thinking about family, about you, about the generations that would live and laugh in these rooms." Mary bustled round the kitchen, preparing for what she called the most important dinner party of our lives. She had invited the entire neighborhood to meet their new grandson and to celebrate the completion of their home. For weeks, she had been planning the menu and cleaning every corner of the house until it sparkled. Mrs. Wilson arrived early with her famous apple pie, the same recipe she had been making for 30 years. The sweet smell of cinnamon and apples filled the kitchen, mixing with the aroma of Mary's roast chicken and fresh bread. Mr. Henry came with his guitar, ready to play the Irish folk songs that always made Thomas smile and remember his childhood. The Petersons brought their grown children and grandchildren. The Johnsons from down the street came with a bouquet of flowers from their garden. Even old Mr. Murphy, who was usually too shy to attend parties, appeared at the door with a bottle of wine and a warm smile. As the evening progressed, Thomas stood in his living room and watched his neighbors fill every corner of his house. Children ran through the hallways where his own children had once played. Adults sat in the kitchen where Mary had taught Emma to bake bread and where she had bandaged James's scraped knees. The sound of laughter and conversation echoed through rooms that Thomas had built board by board. James, now 21 and working as an electrician, was showing some of the younger neighbors the secret hiding places his father had built into the walls. Robert was entertaining everyone with stories about the birds he had been watching in their backyard. Emma sat in the window seat, nursing baby William, while Mrs. Wilson told her stories about Thomas's early days of building. Thomas felt overwhelmed with gratitude. His children were healthy, strong, and happy. His new grandson would grow up surrounded by love and community. The muddy piece of land that nobody had wanted 16 years ago had become the gathering place for the entire neighborhood. Later that night, after all the guests had gone home and the dishes were washed and put away, Thomas and Mary sat together in their living room. The house was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the clock Thomas had built into the mantelpiece. Mary reached over and took Thomas's weathered hand in hers. His hands bore the scars and calluses of 16 years of building, but they were the hands that had created their world. "Thomas," she said softly, looking round at the walls that surrounded them, "you did not just build us a house, you built us a home." The autumn sun filtered through the lace curtains in the kitchen window as Thomas sat at the same wooden table he had built with his own hands 40 years earlier. His hair was now completely white, and deep lines mapped the stories of 8 decades across his weathered face. His hands, once strong enough to carry heavy beams and swing a hammer for hours, now shook slightly when he reached for his morning tea. Thomas was 82 years old, and though his body had grown frail, his eyes still held the same gentle strength that had carried him through so many years of building and dreaming. He lived quietly in the house he had created, tending to Mary's rose garden and fixing small things that broke round their home. William, his grandson, had moved back into the house 6 months earlier. At 25, William should have been starting his career and building his own dreams. Instead, he spent most of his days in his childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling and wondering what had gone wrong with his life. William had graduated from university with good grades, but the job market was difficult. Every interview ended the same way, with polite rejections and promises to call that never came. His savings from his part-time student job were gone, and he felt like a failure living in his grandfather's house while his friends were starting careers and getting married. The young man barely spoke during meals, and Thomas could see the sadness in his grandson's eyes. William reminded Thomas of himself during those dark months when he had broken his arm and could not work. The same look of defeat, the same feeling of being lost and useless. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, Thomas knocked gently on William's bedroom door. "William, would you take a walk with me? I want to show you something." William reluctantly followed his grandfather down the narrow stairs to the basement workshop. The room smelled of sawdust and oil, just as it had when William was a child. Thomas's tools still hung in perfect order on the wooden pegboard he had built decades ago. Each tool had its place, and each one showed signs of years of careful use. Thomas picked up his favorite hammer, the same one he had used to build most of the house. The wooden handle was smooth and dark from years of use, and the metal head bore small dents and scratches that told stories of countless projects. "William," Thomas said, weighing the hammer in his palm, "let me tell you the real story of this house, not the story everyone knows about the man who built his dream, but the true story about fear and failure and learning to keep going anyway." They climbed back upstairs and began walking through each room slowly. Thomas moved carefully, his arthritis making each step deliberate, but his voice grew stronger as he began to share memories that William had never heard before. In the kitchen, Thomas pointed to a section of the floor where the wood grain did not quite match the rest. "I made a mistake here when I was laying the floorboards," he said. "I measured wrong and had to tear up 3 boards and start over. I was so angry with myself that I nearly gave up for the day." Thomas sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs and looked at his grandson. "There were nights, William, when your grandmother and I sat at this table eating nothing but bread and thin soup because that was all we could afford. I was working 2 jobs, but the money barely covered rent and food. Mary would slice the bread so thin you could see through it, but she would range it on our best plate and light a candle, and somehow she made it feel like a feast." They moved to the living room, where afternoon light streamed through the windows Thomas had installed himself. He showed William a spot near the fireplace where the wood was slightly uneven. "I was so tired the day I put in this section," Thomas said, running his fingers over the imperfect joint. "I had worked a 12-hour shift at the construction site. Then came home and worked on the house until midnight. My hands were shaking from exhaustion, and I made this mistake. I almost tore it out and started over. But Mary convinced me to leave it. She said it would remind us that we're human, not machines. In the bedroom where Thomas and Mary had shared 40 years of marriage, Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and spoke in a voice so quiet William had to lean closer to hear. There were many nights when I lay awake in this room, staring at the ceiling I had built, worrying about money and wondering if I was doing the right thing. The house seemed to take forever to finish, and sometimes I wondered if I was fooling myself, thinking I could build something that would last. Thomas looked at his grandson with eyes that held decades of wisdom. But every night I would listen to your grandmother breathing peacefully beside me, and I would remember why I was building this house, not to prove I was successful, but to create a place where love could grow. They ended their walk in William's childhood bedroom, where the secret hiding place Thomas had built still held some of William's old treasures. Thomas sat down on the bed where he had once told bedtime stories and bandaged scraped knees. "William," Thomas said softly, "this house is not perfect. You can see the mistakes in every room if you know where to look, but it has stood strong for 40 years because it was built with persistence, not perfection. Every mistake taught me something. Every difficult day made me stronger." William sat beside his grandfather and really looked at him for the first time in months. He saw not just an old man, but someone who had faced the same fears and doubts that William was feeling now. "Grandfather," William said quietly, "I thought you always knew what you were doing." "I thought success came easily to you," Thomas smiled, and patted his grandson's knee. "Success is not about never falling down, William. It is about getting up one more time than you fall. This house taught me that." On a peaceful winter morning, when fresh snow covered the rose garden like a soft white blanket, Thomas closed his eyes for the last time in the bedroom he had built with his own hands 50 years old. He passed away quietly in his sleep, his weathered face peaceful and his work-worn hands folded gently on his chest. Mary had died 3 years before, and Thomas had spent his final years surrounded by the love of his children and grandchildren. The house had cared for him in his old age just as he had cared for it during its construction. Every morning, he had sat by the kitchen window watching the sunrise, and every evening, he had walked slowly through each room, touching the walls he had built and remembering the dreams that had brought them to life. News of Thomas's passing spread quickly through the neighborhood. People came from every corner of their small community to pay their respects. Mrs. Wilson, now in her 80s, herself, brought flowers from her garden. Mr. Henry's son came with his guitar to play the Irish songs that Thomas had loved. Even families who had moved away years ago returned to honor the man who had shown them what it meant to build a life with dignity and perseverance. The funeral was held in the small church at the end of their street. Every pew was filled with people whose lives Thomas had touched. The young pastor spoke about Thomas's faith and kindness, but it was the stories shared by his neighbors that truly captured who he had been. Charlie, Thomas's old construction foreman, now retired and using a walking stick, stood up slowly and spoke in a voice cracked with emotion. "Thomas was the best worker I ever knew," he said. "Not because he was the fastest or the strongest, but because he never gave up. He taught all of us that honest work is something to be proud of." Mrs. Peterson, the woman who had once doubted Thomas's muddy piece of land, wiped tears from her eyes as she shared how Thomas had helped her family during difficult times. "When my husband lost his job, Thomas came to our door with groceries and never asked for anything in return. He fixed our broken fence and never sent a bill. That was the kind of man he was." After the funeral, The family gathered in Thomas's living room to discuss the future of the house. Emma, now 52 and a grandmother herself, sat in her father's favorite chair. James had become a successful electrician and owned his own business. Robert worked as a teacher and had raised 3 children of his own. Some of the relatives suggested selling the house and dividing the money among the family members. The neighborhood had grown more expensive over the years, and the old house could bring a good price. It seemed like the practical thing to do, but William, who had lived in the house for the past 8 years and had found his purpose again within its walls, stood up and spoke with the quiet determination that reminded everyone of his grandfather. "This house is more than wood and stone," William said, his voice steady and sure. "It is grandfather's legacy. It represents everything he believed about family, community, and never giving up on your dreams. I want to keep it in our family. And I have an idea about how we can honor his memory." William explained his plan to convert Thomas's basement workshop into a community center where neighborhood children and teenagers could learn carpentry and other practical skills. "Grandfather taught me that building things with your hands teaches you patience and confidence," William said. "I want to pass that gift on to other young people who might be struggling to find their way." The family voted unanimously to keep the house and support William's vision. Over the next few months, William worked with local volunteers to transform the basement into a proper workshop. They installed better lighting, organized all of Thomas's tools, and built workbenches where several students could work at the same time. Above the main workbench, William carefully painted Thomas's favorite saying in bold letters: "Build with love, and what you create will last forever." The words served as inspiration for every child who entered the workshop. The community workshop opened on a sunny Saturday morning in spring. 12 children between the ages of 8 and 16 came for the first class. William taught them how to hold a hammer properly, how to measure wood accurately, and most importantly, how to be patient with themselves when they made mistakes. "My grandfather always said that mistakes are just lessons waiting to be learned," William would tell his students when they became frustrated with their projects. 5 years passed, and the workshop had become an important part of the neighborhood. Dozens of children had learned valuable skills, and several had gone on to careers in construction and carpentry. The basement that had once been Thomas's private retreat was now filled with the sounds of young voices, busy hammers, and frequent laughter. William had married a kind woman named Sarah, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. They lived in Thomas's house and had filled it with new love and energy. Their daughter Rose was now 3 years old, a curious little girl with her great-grandfather's bright eyes and her father's gentle nature. One Saturday morning, William found Rose in the workshop, standing on her tiptoes and trying to lift one of Thomas's old hammers with both of her small hands. The hammer was almost as big as she was, but she was determined to use it just like the older children she had watched during workshop sessions. "Daddy," Rose said, looking up at her father with wide, earnest eyes, "tell me about the man who built our house." William picked up his daughter and sat her on the old wooden workbench where Thomas had spent countless hours creating and repairing things for his family and neighbors. Rose's legs dangled freely, and she reached out to touch the painted words on the wall. "Well, Rose," William began, settling his daughter comfortably in his arms, "your great-grandfather Thomas came to this country many years ago with nothing but dreams and strong hands. He was young and scared, but he was brave enough to believe in himself." The end.